Hi, everyone.
Hi, folks. Page 477 of In Search of Christian Freedom. Talking this time about the adjustments of the doctrine of this generation. Although the organization occasionally gives vague recognition to the reversal of understanding regarding its key date of 1914, which for 40 years was viewed as the end of the last days, and when that date passed was changed to the start of the last days, it claims great stability in its holding to this date and its presently assigned significance. In the last 2 decades, however, as that date has receded farther and farther into the past, the organization constantly shifts its definition of the generation of Matthew 24:34, which it links to that date, and which generation is not to pass away before the final end arrives.
Thus, though never specifically stated, for long the general impression was that the generation essentially related to persons who had reached adulthood by 1914, and that the generation of such people would still be alive when the Armageddon arrived. Then the October 8, 1968 Awake, pages 13 and 14, came out with this statement, quote, Jesus was obviously speaking about those who were old enough to witness with understanding what took place when the last days began. Jesus was saying that some of those persons who were alive at the appearance of the sign of the last days would still be alive when God brought this system to its end. Even if we presume that youngsters 15 years of age would be perceptive enough to realize the import of what happened in 1914, it would still make the youngest of this generation nearly 70 years old today. So the great majority of the generation to which Jesus was referring has already passed away in death. The remaining ones are approaching old age. And remember, Jesus said that the end of this wicked world would come before that generation passed away in death. This of itself tells us that the years left before the foretold end comes cannot be many. End of quote.
Taking 15 years as a sort of minimum would, as the article said, have made the youngest of that generation nearly 70 years old at that time, 1968. 10 years later, when that youngest member of that generation would have now been 80 years old, the October 1, 1978 Watchtower, page 31, made a slight shift. The 1968 publication had said Jesus' words obviously referred to persons old enough to understand and be perceptive enough to realize the import of what took place in 1914. Now, 10 years later, this was not so obvious. Instead, the 1978 publication said it could include those who could observe such things as the 1914 war and other conditions. At the same time, it emphatically ruled out application to those who were merely newborn babies at that time. 2 years later, the October 15, 1980 Watchtower, page 31, utilizing a statement in a popular news magazine, brought the point at which persons could begin creating a lasting memory down to 10 years of age.
Back in 1978, the Watchtower had said that when it comes to the application in our time, the generation logically would not apply to babies born during World War I. The passage of yet 6 more years caused the illogical to become logical. The May 15, 1984 Watchtower, pages 4 to 7, reversed the previous position, and by the use of certain definitions found in the works of scholars of Christendom, now said, quote, these definitions embrace both those born around the time of a historic event and all those alive at that time. If Jesus used generation in that sense, and we apply it to 1914, then the babies of that generation are now 70 years old or older. End of quote.
So whereas the October 8, 1968 Awake had referred to 15-year-olds born in 1914 as being in 1968 70 years of age, by 1984 15 years had passed, and we now find the organization talking of babies born in 1914 being 70 years of age. Proverbs 27:16 likens the futility of restraining an obstinately contentious mate to trying to restrain the wind or to grasp oil in the right hand. In a somewhat parallel fashion, attempts at finding anything stable in the Watchtower organization's definition of just what this generation refers to are also like trying to grasp oil. Its slipperiness simply defies one's doing so.
In a little more than 2 decades, the only persons born on or before 1914 will be those who are centenarians?
That's right.
Okay. As documented in Crisis of Conscience, despite the confident-sounding statements in the Watchtower publications, a considerable number of governing body members have long recognized that the traditional teaching about this generation is proving more and more tenuous. There is no other explanation for the fact that in 1980, the members of the Chairman's Committee drew up and presented a document which, if its reasoning had been accepted, would have placed the start of this generation not in 1914, but in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched its first Sputnik.
A similar pattern of shifting definitions can be found in the Watchtower publications' efforts at fixing 1914 as the time when a unique worldwide sign appeared related to war, famine, earthquake, and pestilence. Since the abundant evidence of inconsistencies, of attempts at supporting claims by taking quotations out of context, of ignoring or suppressing contrary historical evidence, are so fully and carefully documented in the book of Carl Olof Jonsson's and Wolfgang Herbst, which is called The Sign of the Last Days, when it seems unnecessary to discuss these here. By the way, that book is also published by Commentary Press, which published Ray's books. Along with scriptural evidence demonstrating the actual sense of the critical term parousia and the expression the last days, the book also presents serious reasons for believing that the whole approach to understanding Jesus' words at Matthew 24, taught not only in the witness organization, but in many other religious systems, proceeds from a wrong premise. Mm-hmm. So we're going to put the link up to Ray's discussion, the video we did on Ray's discussion of the serious suggestion that the last days started in 1957. Governing body members brought that forward, mm-hmm. and it was dismissed. So we'll put that link to Ray's discussion of that Sputnik issue. Mm-hmm. And a document we put together on the parousia. What does the word parousia mean? It's not as if scholars don't know. Mm. We could have been spared all of this if we just paid attention to those scholars and not to what the Watchtower's shifting discussions of the last 150. Well, it's 140 years now since 1879, when they used to say the parousia, the invisible presence of Christ, began in 1874. Mm-hmm. And they're still clinging to that invisible presence notion today. So we'll put the parousia document up.
I think that when you find out that there's these discussions, though, at the governing body level of changing dates, that's a bit alarming. Like for me, it was a bit alarming to find out that there was even the discussion was there. Let's change the date, because that kind of shows you that it's not based on scripture. This is practicality that speaks. Can we change the date to extend time to make it
fly?
To make it fly.
Yeah. There is a footnote here, and it's to another suggestion that was brought to the governing body by one of the governing body members, Albert Schroeder, about the generation understanding. Here's what Ray says about that. The reason for publishing this particular article was that governing body member Albert Schroeder, during a European tour that year, had on his own initiative been suggesting a new understanding of this generation. He suggested its application to the generation of the anointed ones, a definition which would release it from being anchored to the 1914 date and allow for its extension for as long as any of Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever the date of their birth, profess to be of that anointed class. The Watchtower article was designed primarily to reaffirm the organization's holding to its basic traditional position built around 1914. So this is talking about articles published in the 1970s and 1980, and Schroeder had come forth with that around the same time as the Sputnik suggestion. Boy, if we had known that at the time, our faith would have been shaken long before it was. So we'll put the link to the Sputnik one up, and then next time, and also the Parousia one. And how does nautical tacking explain doctrinal U-turns?